All right, welcome back to episode 2 in my full stack recipe app tutorial series. In this one, we'll be working on getting the database hooked up and starting to interact with it through GraphQL. So first up, I've gone to MongoDB's dashboard. I've logged in, and what you're going to want to do is create a new project. I'm going to name this recipes. We'll just name it recipes. That's fine. Add members is just going to be me. All right, so now that we've created the project, we need to build a database. So I'm going to start through that process. I am going to select free because we don't need anything, production ready yet. Doesn't really matter what provider you pick. I'm just going to That's fine. US East. You know what? I'll go Google Cloud and do US Central because I'm in Central. Cluster name doesn't really matter, and then we'll create. All right. So to connect to your database, you're going to need security credentials. So I'm just going to do username is going to be Andrew. Password is going to be YouTube. Great user. All right, next up we have to set IP access lists. So basically this is who can access your database from what IP address. We want it to be accessible from anywhere. So we're going to enter the address 0.0.0.0 and we'll just say this is anywhere. All right, finish and close. All right, it's going to take a minute to deploy. So once it deploys, I'll meet you guys back here and we can continue. All right, so the database has been successfully initialized and you're going to want to go here and click connect so we can integrate it into our project. All right, click drivers, Node.js. We're going to have to copy this and I'll meet you back in VS Code. All right, so to get MongoDB up and running, we're going to need to install a few dependencies. So we're going to add MongoDB and Mongoose. We're also going to add .env, which is an environment variable package that allows you to store sensitive information so that it doesn't upload to GitHub, but you can still access it. So in the server, we're going to start by creating a .env file. And we're going to set a variable MongoDB equals this connection string in the code that MongoDB automatically set up. So the password I created was YouTube cluster 0. Okay, great. All right, the next step is to access that environment variable. So what we need to do is import .env from .env, then run .env.config. All right, now we should have access to our environment variables. So we can say const db equals process.env.d.mongodb, which is the variable we created earlier in our .env file. So then before we start our server, we will run mongoose. We're going to automatically import that. .connect db. Use new URL parser, true. Use unified topology, true. All right, so the next thing we have to do is to define our schemas. So this is basically the format of the data we're storing on MongoDB. You need to define it so that when you need to create and when you need to add new data to the database, it actually will function correctly. Otherwise, it'll throw an error. So we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this models. New file, and we're going to create the schema for a recipe. So to do this, we have to import Mongoose from Mongoose, and that's all we need for now. So we're going to create a new schema variable by saying const recipe schema equals new mongoose dot schema. Then we're going to pass in all the information that we're intending to have in the database. So I'll start with a very simple format for now, and then over time we'll change it as needed. So we're going to start off with the field title. We're going to expect that each recipe will have a title. This is going to be a string. It is going to be required. Now, if you set something to be required, it won't allow you to post new entries into the database unless you have that field. So a lot of the time, if you run into weird errors and you're not really sure what the error means, often it's because something's required in your schema that you didn't put, and it's throwing a weird error. That's one I've run into quite a bit. All right, so the next thing we're going to put in here is going to be ingredients. Now, ingredients is going to be a little bit more complex than just a simple string, because we have ingredient names and then ingredient measures. What we want is we're going to have our list of ingredients. So we need to set this, since it's going to be a little bit more complex than just a core type, we need to set it to be its own schema. So we're going to say type of ingredient schema required true. So now, before we use ingredient schema, we of course have to define ingredient schema. Otherwise, you will get a weird error. So we're going to define a new ingredient schema variable by doing new mongoose.schema. And I'm sorry, this is going to be an array of ingredient schema. All right, so the ingredient schema is going to be composed of two items, the ingredient itself and the measure. So we'll do ingredient name, and this is going to be type string required true. Then next is going to be ingredient measure type string required true. All right, so now we have our ingredient schema defined and our recipe schema defined. We also need to add one more item, which is going to be instructions. And this is going to be just very simple type string array. Sorry, I didn't explain it earlier, but if you put square brackets around a type, it's denoting that it's going to be an array of that type. And this is also going to be required. All right, so now we have to actually execute the model and get it in a consumable format for other files. So we're going to export const recipe equals mongoose.model. We're going to pick what we want the collection to be in the database. So we're going to call this recipes. And then we're going to use the recipe schema. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create just some placeholder data inside our database so we can retrieve it with GraphQL and see that everything's working correctly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here. Where is it? Overview. I'm going to connect, and I'm going to use MongoDB Compass, which is a it's okay, ask me later. It's basically just a desktop version of navigating through MongoDB Cloud. So I'm gonna do my password, which again is YouTube, and I'm gonna save and connect, and I'm gonna call this recipes. Color doesn't matter, green. All right, the next thing we need to do is create a database. We're going to call this recipe app. Collection name, we'll create a collection. Let's call it recipes. Create database. All right, so now we have a database, recipe app, and within recipe app we have recipes. So we're going to insert just one field or one document so we can test it out, see if it's working. So we have the ID, that's fine. We need title, and it's going to be tester. We need ingredients, and that's going to be an array. And then one of the items is going to have, let's take a look back at our model, ingredient name and ingredient measure. So let's do ingredient name, salt, ingredient measure, 1 teaspoon. What's the error here? There we go. All right, that's fine. Okay, so we have our initial ingredient list, and then we need one more thing, which is going to be, was it instructions or directions? Instructions, okay. Instructions. All right, and that's also going to be an array of strings. 1, cook food. 2, eat food. Okay. And let's insert that. All right, so this is going to be, like I said, very basic, but we're just testing to see retrieval of data and if we can access it correctly. So the next thing we need to do is go into our type defs. We need to create a new query, and we need to define a new query. So our new query is going to be get recipes. And we're going to expect an array of type recipe, which we have not created yet. So let's create a new GraphQL type so we can correctly return data. So type recipe. It's going to have the same fields as the Mongoose model that we created earlier. So it's going to have an ID. Let's not forget that. It's going to be of type ID. Ingredients is going to be of type ingredient, and instructions is going to be of type array of string. So now, since we created the ingredient type, we need to create another type ingredient. Let's create this before. Type ingredient, and an ingredient is going to include ingredient, what is it, ingredient name, ingredient name, and ingredient measure. Ingredient name, and this is going to be string. Ingredient measure, also a string. All right, let's save that. And that should be all we need for the types. Now we need to go into our resolvers, and in the type query, we're going to have a new resolver for get recipes, and this is going to be an async function because it takes time to retrieve data from the database. We also, before I forget, we need to import the Mongoose schema so that we know what we're looking for. So we need to import recipe. Okay, that's a missing closing brace, but that's fine. So this is going to be await recipe dot find, and dot find is the basic MongoDB command for finding. It will return all of a certain schema type. You can also put in braces here, specific keys you want to search by, but we don't need that right now. So what we want to do is now go to our server, and then let's refresh. Okay, look, there we go. It's already here. We want to do an example query of get recipes, and we want to retrieve all the fields, just so we can have all the information available. Okay, well, slight issue. I don't think I connected to the database. All right, so I ended up figuring out the issue. I wasn't connecting to the correct database. So as you see, in my cluster that I created, it created a test database because I hadn't specified a database in the Mongoose connection. So I don't want to connect to the test database. I want to connect to my recipe app database, because as you see in the recipes here, there's nothing. And in recipes here, there is something. So the way that you need to fix this is to go to your index.js, and when you connect to the DB, you need to set the DB name to be recipe app. After a little bit of Googling, I managed to figure it out. Easy issue to run into, so there's how you fix it. So now when we go to our Apollo server sandbox and run the query, so yeah, you can see as we fulfill the query, we've received the data that we originally created and put in our database. So now we can use that data, we can send it to the front end, and that's how you connect MongoDB to GraphQL and have it return the correct information. All right, so the next step we want to take is getting this information from our server, which we now have access to the database information. We want to get it from our server to our front end. We'll work on, posting new recipes later, but for now we want to get it so we can actually connect and see it displayed in our React app. So that's what we're going to work on next. So the first thing we're going to do is come into app.jsx, and we're just going to clear out most of the stuff in here that we don't need. So pretty much everything. It's just Vite boilerplate. We're going to just have a div with open and closing tags, hello world. Now that we've gotten rid of hello world, what we're going to do is start setting up the Apollo client and GraphQL on the front end. So we need to go into the client directory. We need to add at Apollo client and GraphQL. So the next thing we need to do in the client is to create a new folder. This is going to hold all of our Apollo related logic and helpers. So we're going to create a new file here, Apollo client.js. And then in Apollo client.js, we need to import Apollo client in memory cache from at Apollo client. We're gonna instantiate a new client by saying const client equals new Apollo client. And then we need to interact directly with our server by entering the URI, which is gonna be the address of our server. So we have to connect to the IP address, which you can find at least on Mac by going to System Preferences, Network, and then your IP address, which is right here. So this is the sequence of numbers we need. We're going to copy this in as 10.129.1.101. And then remember, we also need to include the port 4000, which we're currently running on, or the server is currently running on. And then we need to set the cache to be new in memory cache. And then, of course, export default client, so we can access it from other files. Okay, the next file we need to create is our queries.js file. This is going to include all the queries we want to retrieve information from our server. So we're going to import GQL. Import GQL from Apollo client. Then we're going to export a new query, and these traditionally are all in caps. So we're gonna say we're gonna call this query query recipes, and we're gonna say it equals GQL. Remember, using the GraphQL query language or syntax, which is necessary for this. We're gonna say query recipes. We're gonna say, oh, what was it? What did we call it in our server? It was get recipes. So we're gonna say get recipes, and we want the data. We want to input the data specifically that we want to retrieve. So let's just do it all. And it's going to look exactly like how it looks here in the Apollo sandbox. So forgive the messiness here. Basically, we want to just copy all of this. So we're going to go over here to our queries. I'll just replace this, and we'll retrieve all those key value pairs that we had originally set up. All right, so the next step is to go into our main.jsx, and what we need to do is import the Apollo client that we created earlier. Let me see, what did I call it? All right, it's just client. Import client. Actually, it's not. It's going to be a default. It's going to be a default export. So we're going to do import client from /Apollo client, and then we need to wrap app in Apollo provider. It's going to import that. Let's move that up one. We need to put the closing tag on the other side of app, save, and now we should have access to Apollo Forgetting one thing, we need to add in client equals client. All right, so now we have our Apollo setup for the front end. Next, we can go into our app.jsx. Let's just get rid of all these unnecessary imports. Let's import a few things we need. We're going to need to import use query from at Apollo client. And in our app, we're going to say, we're going to destructure here, loading error data equals use query, and we want to say query recipes. We're going to import that from our queries file that we created earlier. I'm going to move this up again. All right, so now we have loading error data, and that's querying our query recipes query. That's a lot of queries all in a row, but you get the idea. We can say if loading return loading, just to make sure we don't show anything under the hood that we don't want to see. That's fine for now. All right, and then when we have our recipes, which will be in the data, let's do it like this. Let's import use state from React. All right, so we're going to create a new state variable. Recipe list, set recipe list equals use state. It's going to be empty for now. We also want to do import use effect, and then we're going to create a use effect right here. And then in our dependency array, we want to have data, so that whenever data updates, we can set the recipe list to be whatever data we've retrieved. Oops. Okay. Looks like I imported Apollo client from the wrong directory. So we're gonna do // This should work. All right. Now let's check our. Actually, let's. What we should do is. I can't remember exactly how this data returns, but I'm gonna console.log the recipe list, or sorry, data, so we can see exactly what format the data comes in. Let's go to the developer tools, inspect. All right, so we have an object. This is the data. Okay, so it's in get recipes. So we need to set the recipe list to data.get recipes. All right, so then we'll just have this be an empty array to start because it's going to return as an array. So what we want to do is div in here, and what we want to have this be is recipe list dot map. We're going to have recipe and index, and we want to have them return a div with a closing tag, of course. And we want to say, for now, let's just return the title. But it looks like we didn't actually set that in our original query. Yeah, title. Let's see. Let me make sure we have that as an option. I don't know if we define that in our original schema here. Let's see. Type defs. Recipe, we forgot the title. So recipe title, we need to add to our type defs. So ID, of course, will still be there, but we need title, and that's going to be a string. And then that should now be queryable for us. All right, we're back. Okay. All right, so we're having an issue. Let me see if I can figure out exactly what the issue is. It seems to be working in the Apollo server sandbox, so let's do a little reload and see, maybe that fixes it. All right, well, at the very least we need to add a individual key for each and let's put this in braces so it actually returns the variable. All right, so there we go, it works. So now we have it mapping through our recipe list and returning specifically the title of each recipe. We can of course change this to be the recipe.id. It may be ._id. No, what is it? Well, yeah, there we go. It's just ID. And this is of course the specific ID that it exists with in MongoDB. You can see here 6471208, 6471208. So there you see, there's our initial connection between client, server, and database all put together. So I think that's going to do it for this episode, and in the next we'll start working on hooking up authentication and getting things looking a little bit nicer. So thank you guys for joining me, and if you enjoyed so far, please leave a like, comment, subscribe, whatever you feel like doing, and I appreciate it, and I'll see you guys next time.